One unremarkable day, a young man appeared at the district military enlistment office. His appearance was immediately striking, clothes covered with road dust, hair falling carelessly over his shoulders, and a look of fatigue mixed with confusion. He seemed completely out of place in the austere atmosphere of this place, where you'd normally expect to see conscripts dressed to the hilt, ready to serve. There was no hint of bravado or purpose in his appearance. Rather, he looked like a traveler lost in the maze of life, a man who seemed to have nowhere to go. Many would probably have taken him for a common vagrant or a wandering passerby without paying much attention. Indeed, he himself seemed unencumbered by any ambitions or dreams. His presence in the military enlistment office, a place where life connected with the future usually boiled up, looked like an accident. But it was this man, outwardly unremarkable, who made an unusual request. He declared his desire to serve in the elite troops. It sounded so unexpected that the staff of the military enlistment office, unable to restrain themselves, burst out laughing. His request seemed to be something out of the ordinary, a ridiculous joke he had decided to play. The boy, grimacing at the mockery, as if struck by it, lowered his gaze. This moment was filled with contradiction. His unremarkable appearance, his seemingly indifferent attitude to life, and suddenly such an unexpected, bold desire. In this contrast lay the whole intrigue. And now, at this moment, when everything seemed to have been decided, another, no less important character whose appearance will change everything entwines into the story. The laughter died down as soon as the general, with his whole appearance radiating unshakable confidence, walked toward the young man. He paid no attention to the surprised looks of his subordinates, as if there was only him and this guy standing in front of him, a little shrunken from the recent ridicule. The general took the young man's documents from the hands of one of the officers and, without taking his eyes off the papers, began to scrutinize them. Tension hung in the air, and even time seemed to slow down. The general's face, usually impenetrable, suddenly froze in an expression that was difficult to describe in a single word. Surprise? Bewilderment? Some deep, almost forgotten memory? He froze, as if trying to see, through the printed letters, something more than just a name and date of birth, a last name. The surname was familiar to him. It echoed in the depths of his memory, pulling long-buried images to the surface. He looked up, and gazing into the young man's face, spoke it aloud, quietly, almost cautiously, as if afraid to break the fragile thread that had suddenly stretched across the years. It wasn't just a set of letters on paper, it was an echo of the past, a fragment of a story he had thought was long over. Pictures of bygone years surfaced in his mind, the trenches, the explosions, the faces of the men with whom he had shared both joys and sorrows. He remembered his old friend, with whom they had fought shoulder to shoulder in the most difficult conditions, when it seemed that there was no hope left. The man who had given his life for his country, for the ideals they both believed in. And now, in front of him, stood the grandson of this man, a young boy, whom everyone was quick to write down in the category of vagrants and losers. A boy in whose eyes he now saw not only weariness, but a glimmer of something more, something that had been inherited from his grandfather. This guy, who seemed so unremarkable, was a living link to the past, a keeper of the memory of an entire era, of a bygone generation of heroes. Right now, looking at him, the general realized that not everything was as simple as it seemed at first glance, that behind the outer shell could be hidden something truly valuable. He uttered the name, and that sound was the beginning of a new turn of history in which the fates of different generations were intertwined. A story in which there was still much to learn, understand, and comprehend. It was as if the general was doused with ice water. In an instant, all his ideas about the world, about people, about who was worthy of trust and respect, began to crumble like a house of cards. He, who had been through fire and water, who had seen so many human destinies, suddenly realized how deceptive appearances can be. How many times had he himself perhaps succumbed to stereotypes, judging by clothes, by first impression? In front of him stood not just a guy in dusty clothes, not another wanderer, as it might seem at first glance. In his eyes, tired, but at the same time keeping some inner depth, the general saw a reflection of the past he himself so often recalled. This was the grandson of his battle comrade, a man whose name was forever inscribed in the history of their country, a man who had given his life for its freedom. This connection, suddenly emerging from the shadows of the past, struck him to the core. He suddenly realized that this young man, whom he had almost written off, was the keeper of the memory of an entire era, of a generation strong in spirit, of men for whom duty and honor were not just words. Inner strength, courage, fortitude, all this seemed to be hidden behind his unremarkable appearance, behind disheveled hair and careless clothes. The general realized that the true value of a man is not in his outward appearance, his ambitions, or his social status, but in what he carries within himself, in his inner content, in his connection with the past and the future. Gradually, through the veil of surprise, a picture began to clear in the general's mind. He ceased to see in this young man a vagabond, an accidental passerby. Now before him stood the heir of a great man, the bearer of the memory of heroic deeds, a man who might have been capable of something remarkable himself. This discovery fundamentally changed his attitude toward the lad. The initial disappointment and skepticism had been replaced by surprise and perhaps even hope. He looked at him now with different eyes, full of respect and interest. The contrast between the first impression and the true nature of this young man was so strong that it made one think of many things. About how easily we succumb to stereotypes, how often we lose sight of the most important thing hidden behind an unremarkable shell. This meeting opened new horizons for him, made him rethink a lot of things. But how this guy, with such a difficult fate, will be able to prove himself in the army environment, and what other surprises life prepares him, it's another story. And then, in an instant, everything turned upside down. The general, whose shoulders had seen a lot, whose gaze seemed to be able to pierce any armor, froze. Before him stood not merely a young man eager for service, but a living echo of the past, an echo of a courage he had thought almost lost. In the eyes of this unremarkable lad, behind a layer of fatigue and confusion, something else suddenly appeared, a glimmer of the same steadfastness that the general remembered so well from his comrade. It was like a flame smoldering beneath the ashes of everyday life, ready to burst forth at any moment. He saw not a vagrant, not a passerby, but the heir to the very power, the very spirit that had once crushed his enemies. In him, in this young man, lurked a certain potential that was not yet obvious to others, but which the general felt in his gut. It wasn't just a desire to serve, it was more than that. It was a desire to continue the work inherited from his ancestors, a desire that seemed to smolder in his genes. And now, this boy's story, a story that began as a ridiculous joke, was turning into something meaningful, something that would change not only his life, but the lives of those around him. From an unremarkable young man, he seemed ready to become a hero, and this transformation was just beginning. His path to exploits will not be paved with glory. He will wade through doubts, prejudice, and distrust. But his inner core, inherited from his grandfather, will help him to stand. After all, heroes are not born. They become heroes by breaking stereotypes and exceeding expectations. And this story, which began in a dusty military recruitment center, promised to become something more than just a story about how an unremarkable man became a hero. It opened the door to a world where appearances are deceptive and true strength lurks in the most unexpected places. And how this path will develop, what fate awaits this young man, and what other secrets are hidden in his past. That's another story. And so, the story of this young man, whose appearance deceptively hid the depth of his soul, comes to its conclusion, leaving us alone with reflections. It is like a sobering, cold shower that washes away our superficial judgments. After all, what do we really know about a person after barely looking at him or her? How many times have we jumped to conclusions without bothering to look deeper into their inner world, where the real treasures may lurk? This guy, who at first was mistaken for a vagrant, turned out to be a keeper of memory, a living testimony to the courage of an entire generation. He was not just the grandson of the hero, he was his continuation, the bearer of the same indomitable will and willingness to sacrifice. And isn't that what true valor is all about? Not in shining armor and loud words, but in the quiet strength that lives in the heart, in the readiness to stand up for what is dear. The general, battle-hardened, a man whose ideas about the world seemed immutable, suddenly realized how easy it is to be deceived by the outside. He realized that to judge a book by its cover is to miss the essentials. As a rule, the truth lies deeper, in what we do not see at first glance. This meeting was not just an accident, but a lesson that turned his worldview upside down. This young man's story is a call to us all. It reminds us that each of us can become a hero if we have a spark that can ignite into a flame. It doesn't matter where we come from or what we look like. What matters is what we carry within us. What matters is what we are willing to give to the world. And maybe it is in the most inconspicuous corners of our lives that the very treasures we are looking for lurk. This story is certainly hopeful. It tells us that the past is alive, that it influences the present, and that even in the most unexpected places, we can find echoes of great events. It reminds us of the importance of memory, of the value of the heritage we pass on from generation to generation. For it is this connection to the past that makes us who we are. It gives us the strength and inspiration to move forward. And looking at this guy, we realize that history is not over yet, and that he has his own path ahead of him, filled with strength and meaning. But there is another aspect of this story that may have escaped our attention.